Okay, welcome. We're going to be looking at dye electrophoresis, a way to model DNA electrophoresis to analyze a product of PCR, which we'll talk about shortly in a moment. My name is Erin McKay. I'm a longtime teacher at Tracy High in California. I also work here at Lawrence Livermore Lab as a faculty scholar teaching at the Edward Teller Center of Education, doing biotech teacher ed during the summer. So if we look here at this document, you probably can't read it from here, but you can download it. This is a document that I actually provide my students when I want them to do more of an inquiry style of evaluating and using the process of electrophoresis. I've used it with my freshmen. I've also used it with biotech students, which are sophomores through seniors. You could potentially use it with middle school students. It's all about kind of where you aim, the background you give, and what product you expect them to produce. Are you asking for a formal lab report? Are you asking them to just do a discussion, poster, etc., etc.? So one thing you'll notice on this document is there are a bunch of links. We will not be showing those links. You can watch them in your own time, but I find them essential for actually teaching the students. In the links, the first one is that just the actual link from which I extracted it, which is a Bio-Rad document. And then from there, hold on, we're having some sound issues. Are we good? Okay. So you can actually pull up the full document from Bio-Rad, which also includes information on how you could order a simple to assemble type kit for dye electrophoresis. And then from there are some YouTube videos that I use to teach how to load a gel, how to run a gel, how to make agarose, which I will be walking through step by step. And then after that, it goes over some key background information. So let's just talk about what dye electrophoresis is. So electrophoresis is a way that we can separate DNA, ideally. DNA has a negative charge to it. And so if we can run a current through it, and we load the DNA at the negative side of a gel, and then we run it to the positive, the DNA will separate out, and it separates by size. It does not separate linearly, it separates logarithmically, so little tiny pieces move very fast, big pieces of DNA move very slow. Now, obviously, we're not going to be using DNA in this lab because it's much more expensive to use. There are labs you can use with your students that does do full-on DNA electrophoresis, but I would use this as either an intro to this, to doing DNA electrophoresis, or I would use it in place of it as a cost-saving mechanism. So with electrophoresis, you can also separate dyes. So dyes, I explain to my students, are going to act as our model DNA. And with this, you can set it up in many different scenarios. I prefer the crime scene scenario because then you're looking at trying to find a perfect match, the crime scene bands in the gel versus the suspects, versus if you were trying to do paternity, because then you have the whole issue of only looking at half matches, and it gets much more complicated. Especially because with most dyes, it's hard to come up with more than a few colors of primary dyes to work with. So I'm actually going to be using basic food coloring dyes, which come in red, green, blue, and yellow. And then when you separate your dyes, it's all about making sure you've pre-mixed them in advance so that you get a crime scene and a suspect that will match, and two other suspects that distinctly don't match. And it will keep your life easy. I think going beyond 3 suspects, it just gets too complicated. For the students, it gets too complicated for you with mixing, makes the increased chance of contamination with students' bad lab technique, etc. So let's go ahead and just jump to working through the lab, and then if there are background questions that you have, you can go ahead and ask me, and we will deal with those during question and answer. We already have a couple of questions that I will address during that time. So first things first, I have my lab set up here, and just move. We will look at how you make an agarose gel. So there are a couple of things you're going to need. You're going to need a reagent bottle. You want it to be at least twice the volume of what you're making. I haven't graduated. Oh, thank you. I need to put on my safety glasses. Full PPE. Not only just is it good technique, it's also good modeling for your students. And you have your graduated cylinder, which I've already pre-measured out, and my agarose powder. And I've already pre-made my label here. It says 2% mass to volume agarose solution. My initials, well, actually my first initial, last name, and the date. There aren't any significant hazards, so I'm leaving that off. So what you would do, it's a little different when you're making an agarose solution from when you're going to be making other solutions, because of the hydroscopic tendencies of agarose and its ability to clump. So I find it much easier to put all of the solute, in this case this is 1 xTAE, you buy it usually in a concentrated solution of 50 xTAE, and then you dilute it down to your working concentration of 1 xTAE. So for example, if you wanted to make 100 mils of it, you'd put 2 mils of 50 xTAE in, and then you would add 998 mils of distilled water, and voila. Or not 900, 98 mils. Don't try and do math in your head when it comes to making solutions. So I have 110 mils of 1 xTAE. I'll put it in the reagent bottle. Now, I'm making enough that I could potentially pour 2 gels. That's just kind of like, I like to have backup, especially when you're demonstrating to students, or when students are making things, it's always good to have a little bit extra on hand. The gel trays that I will be using to pour a gel for using the dielectrophoresis actually hold about 50 mils. I found that when you're going to do dielectrophoresis, the dye molecules are very small, and so they are actually separating based on their negative charge differences. Some are more negatively charged, some are less negatively charged, and that is more of the difference of what in their separation than their mass size. And so you need a pretty thick gel to allow for any significant separation. So a lot of times when you're doing DNA gels, you'll do a 1% mass to volume, which is 1 gram of agarose solution and 100 milliliters of 1 xTAE. There are other buffer solutions you can use. I just happen to have 1 xTAE on hand in my classroom and here at the lab. You could also play with borax powder, which is much, much cheaper, but I don't know the exact working concentration, so you would have to play with that a bit. So we want to avoid clumping when we're going to make our agarose solution. So you first start with a powder. This is agarose. It's very expensive. If you're buying it in small quantities, it's going to run you between about $1.50 and $2 a gram. And I have here 2.2 grams of the agarose solution, so that will be dissolved in 110 milliliters of 1 xTAE. And I find that to ensure to avoid clumping, you want to have an active swirl going. So I'm going to use my dominant hand, I'm right-handed, to swirl. I'm going to pinch the whey boat. I could use a powder funnel, but I just find it much easier just to pinch the whey boat. And slowly and consistently pour in, and try and get as much of it as evenly distributed as possible. And then keep swirling and swirling and swirling. Now you'll notice there's still powder left in the whey boat. And if this were any other solution like a salt solution and I needed to make an exact concentration, I would take distilled water and rinse it in, or 1 xTAE and rinse it in. But agarose does not like to do that. It just makes a gunky mess and it's not worth it. So you just always expect you'll not quite transfer all of it. Now, most of the time students kind of make a mess of this. They'll get all the powder in, if you emphasize how to do that, but they will not do a great job with the swirling. And so when in doubt, screw the lid on, shake the heck out of it. It's not ideal because then you'll get agarose around the edges of it. And when you're melting it, that can kind of create a nasty mess. But it's better than having clumps in your agarose. So you want to make sure it's a nice, thoroughly mixed, kind of opaque white. And then you would thoroughly unscrew the lid, and you put it in the microwave on half power, and going at about 30-second intervals to 1-minute intervals, depending on the strength of your microwave, until it is completely melted and translucent. Now, it's very important that the lid is just sitting on it and not even engaged to any of the threads, because you do not want to turn your reagent bottle into a de facto bomb and have glass shards flying everywhere out of your microwave. It's not a pleasant thing, and you don't want to fill out the legal paperwork for injuring yourself or students. So we're going to play Magic Microwave. It's already been done. So I have this sitting in a hot water bath at about 60 degrees Celsius. Ideally, the temperature to pour a gel at is about 55 degrees Celsius. Think of a really good bottle of, or a really good cup of hot coffee. You can hold it comfortably. It's nice and warm, but you can keep holding it. Now, some of you have a better heat tolerance than others. So if you can hold things right out of the oven, ask somebody else to take it. So I just kind of hold it like this. And yes, it gets a little bit warm. Okay, this is 60 degrees. So, but it shouldn't be too hot by the time I'm actually using it. And you can see by looking at it, once you've melted it, it goes fully translucent. And it is completely consistent all the way through. there is no kind of weird wispies to it, which happens when it's only half melted. So our next step is prepping your gel tray. So I'm going to just put the label on here so we know exactly what this is. You never want to have a bottle unlabeled in your classroom. And so here we have a gel tray and a gel comb. Now they come in all different shapes and sizes depending on who your manufacturer of your gel box is. So this is a gel box. Let me just get it in view so you can see it. Just move the graduated cylinder out of the way before I knock it over. And so it's got a lid. And then the chamber technically is called an electrophoresis chamber or horizontal electrophoresis chamber, not to be confused with the vertical ones which you use on protein gels. But most of the time you just call it a gel box. And it's got platinum wires in here that you always tell kids to like never ever touch, and threaten them and threaten them and threaten them. So usually they're pretty good about it. You just tell them what it costs to replace the gel box, and that's usually good enough to keep them from messing about with it. So I'm going to move this out of my way. Now certain gel trays come with a nice little gasket thing, and like they're easy to pour your gels, and you just read the directions, and life is easy. But if you get a gel tray like this, this is where blue tape becomes our friend. And it's always fun to work with blue tape when you have gloves on and you're used to having nails. Come on. There we go. So take a substantial piece of blue tape. It's always better to have more than you think you need. And you want to, it's kind of like wrapping a package very tightly along the edge, because you want to make sure that you can thoroughly go here, underneath, using the back of your thumb, your nail, thoroughly, completely, and utterly seal it up. So it doesn't need to go all the way up here. Yeah, that's pretty thick gel to pour. It just needs to be high enough that you can pour your gel, but it's more important that it's sealed here so that you don't actually ooze out everything everywhere. And then you just tape the other side. So, or if I'm getting tape off. Come on. When in doubt, take out your glove. Use the nail. I have tape dispensers in my classroom, so now I need a new glove because I'm not going to get that one back on. Jeff, can you grab me a medium-sized glove? So again, it's more about making sure you can get thoroughly underneath it. Thank you. And completely sealed. And these ones have a lovely additional little side lip, which makes life more frustrating. So it's very exciting to watch gels get taped. So there we go. We've got it nicely taped up. And then you just use your gel comb and you set it in here. Now these gel trays happen to come with these little combs that just kind of click in. In my classroom we have gel combs that come with little feet, and you have to use a little penny and some patience. Set them just right. You can also put another comb in here if you were to quote-unquote double stack the gel, which is great if you're trying to run a lot of samples, not so great if you're trying to just be cheap and trying to get a whole bunch of students on one gel, because if you try and do that, well, it just takes forever to have 16 students working on a gel. So I'm just going to swirl my agarose again, just to make sure it's nicely swirled. I'm going to quickly double check it visually. Yep, I don't see any clumps forming. And so I'm only going to use half the agarose to pour a gel, because again, about 50 milliliters. I always make a little bit more than I need. So if I were just making one gel and didn't want to have backup for a whole second gel in case of an accident, I would make 55 milliliters. So you just pour slowly and consistently, and you want to get it so that it's up the combs about half the way, maybe 2/3 of the way. You do not want to run all the way up to the top of the comb. Occasionally you get bubbles. Give them a moment. You see if they'll actually pop on their own. If they really don't, you can grab a tip. Oh, it popped. And you can pop it with a micropipette tip. Okay, so we're going to have a little bit of magic, and we're not going to wait for that to solidify because it takes forever. So here is our pre-solidified gel. So I'm going to move this out of the way. And we'll look at how you set up a gel box. So first of all, I'm going to turn it around. I always like to have the black, which is the negative, away from me, and the red, which is the positive, toward me. Now, usually when you're having students load this, you're going to have the odd lefty. So I always set the gel boxes up so that they are directly perpendicular to the edge of the working space, so that it doesn't matter. If they're all right-handed, a lot of times they'll like to bias it for loading the gel. So first thing you're going to do is you are going to take off the tape, and don't forget the bottom, and take off the tape. There we go. And try not to get it stuck all over you. I end up with all sorts of weird tape in pockets, in my dryer. But that's life. Okay, so one person had asked, what is the maximum voltage that you can actually run a gel at? And that depends on the running buffer that you use. Now, I used 1xTAE to make my gel as my solvent. But you can use either 1xTAE with a maximum of 100 volts when you're running your gel, or you can use 0.25xTAE, and you can use a maximum of 200 volts. 200 volts allows you to run it faster. But if you're like me and you're making a whole bunch of it, and you make it really quick and with not the greatest precision or accuracy, and so I know it's like 0.2 to 0.3 xTAE, I would limit your voltage to 170 volts. So what we need to do is we need to get that comb out of that gel, which can make a bit of a mess, but that's life. So I'm just going to splash them on here, because it's a lot easier to pull a comb if there's a little bit of buffer on it. And then patience and straight up. Okay. Move the comb out of my way. Then I'm going to put the gel tray. So now I have the gel tray in the gel box, but there's not enough running buffer in any way, shape, or form. You have to cover the electrode wires, and then you also have to cover the whole gel about 1 millimeter to 2 millimeters above the height of the gel. And you also want to make sure that your wells, which are the holes made by the combs, are completely filled in. So I'm just going to pour. That's still way too low. You must pray that you don't get the leaky box, because, you know, especially if you're doing like a borrowing thing from your local county office of ed or some other program where you've gone and done a training, sometimes gel boxes get knocked about and they get little cracks, and sometimes the cracks are just superficial and you don't care, and then you discover the crack is not superficial and your gel box is leaking. So let's see, yeah, that looks about right. Okay. So that's ready. So let me just talk about my scenario for this setting, for this dye electrophoresis. So here I have 3 sets of dye. They're mixes of dyes, they're just food coloring. So this is my crime scene. This is quote-unquote suspect 1, suspect 2, and suspect 3. Now, all I did is I made different combinations from food coloring dyes. I added a little bit of Cura syrup as a weighting. You can also use glycerol. I always like to use blue in each of them, just simply because it makes a dark enough background that if you're putting reds or yellows or greens, it can obscure any of those color combinations as long as it's high enough concentration. And I do a 5 to 10% dye solution, so that's volume to volume. So pretty much you do 1 part dye to 9 parts water and Cura syrup, or 1 part to 19 parts. That'll usually make your dye dark enough to work with, but not so dark as to see these massive blobs that will separate out. So I have different color combinations, and one of them I actually just took from the crime scene and put into either suspect 1, suspect 2, suspect 3. So we will be trying to figure out who left their DNA at the crime scene. Now, we all have students who have varying backgrounds, so you can read your classroom accordingly. This year, I used a really silly setup. So the crime scene was the bathroom in the science building, and it was the body of a 6-foot cockroach and an unidentifiable person from the school administration who had saved us from the 6-foot cockroach. And we had 3 missing staff members. The principal was missing, the maintenance guy was missing, and our AVID coordinator was missing. I chose students or staff members that my students interact with regularly. So they'd have a little buy-in, but it was also completely silly. So if they had some sort of interaction with the criminal justice system in their background or family members did, it was so silly it shouldn't really matter. So the question is, who sacrificed themselves? So, you know, we went off to the bathroom or to the principal, the maintenance guy, and the AVID coordinator's house, quote unquote, and collected their toothbrushes to get their DNA samples. We did PCR and to make billions of copies of their DNA. And then we are now going to do gel electrophoresis of the PCR products to see which has the DNA to match the crime scene DNA. So that's kind of the basic scenario. If you have older students or advanced students, you could talk about what PCR is in more depth. With my freshmen, I just kept it pretty brief. They'd done a little reading on the background of what PCR is, but we didn't try and do any kind of mock PCR. Okay, so I found that these wells hold quite nicely about 20 microliters of solution, whether it's dye or DNA, but the dye is very floaty, even when you weight it with Duracell. So I'm only going to load 15 microliters. So I have a micropipette. I will show you later a cheaper alternative to using a micropipette. And so these are P20 tips. They fit nicely on our micropipette. And so I've just got it set. And on the document I give you, there is a link to teaching students how to use micropipettes if you have access to these. And then if not, the simpler, cheaper version, they're pretty self-explanatory. So I'm going to load crime scene in well 1, and then I'm going to load suspect 1, the principal, in well 2. And then in 2, this makes it kind of complicated, so I usually let the students write it down. In 2 is where we're going to put the maintenance guy, and in 3 is where we're going to put the AVID coordinator. And the nice thing is there are 8 wells, so if a kid accidentally pokes through a well, et cetera, they can go ahead and try again, and they just know which well it's actually loaded in. So, and also in the links I provided a great video from a community college on how to load and how not to load wells to create yourself problems. Okay, so crime scene. Oh, I forgot to bring my little disposal cup. Oh, thanks, Jeff. It's very important that the students know that they need to replace their tips for their loading after each sample, otherwise they will contaminate between suspects and crime scene. So here goes the principal's DNA for his toothbrush. And then the maintenance guy's DNA. And then finally, the AVID coordinator's DNA from her toothbrush. Now in class, we of course use their names, but get out of the way, you little devil. Okay. And you could, if you had students who were pretty good at loading gels, you could even have them load each sample twice, so you could have repetition and ability to verify that you didn't have contamination or anything. So what you're going to do is you then lock on the lid. So the black is a negative, the red is positive, the dye is negatively charged just like DNA, but remember dye, as I tell you in the background handout, is the main differentiating between the different colors of dye is the amount of charge, not the size of the molecule, whereas with DNA, it is more of the size of the molecule that sorts the DNA than the charge. So just lock this on. Make make sure it's nice and clipped down. I have a power supply. See if I can get it into view a little bit. There we go. And it's very important you go color to color again, black to black, red to red. Okay. Now I'm using 0.25x TAE. That allows me to do a quicker run in the classroom. I would highly encourage you to do all the background information first, and then the day of the gel, especially if you have an hour or less in your period, just a quick reminder of the safety and get them loading the gel so that ideally you'd have them do a 20 to 30 minute run of their dye so they can get nice separation. Okay, so with 0.25 you can actually run, even if you be really lazy, 0.25, so it's 0.2 to 0.3x TAE. You can run it at 170 volts without worrying about melting your gel and having your samples just completely lost. If you have a block period and you want to just use 1x TAE, then you can run it for closer to, half an hour, 45 minutes. So I've set it at 170 volts, and I'm just going to hit run. And then I need to verify it's actually working. What you look for is you look for the bubbles that are coming off of the platinum wires. There should be more bubbles on the black wire than there are on the red wire. And then you just wait a few moments, and you should start to see that the dye is diffusing. Or not diffusing, but it's starting to, quote-unquote, run down the gel. It's also important that you remind the students that it's important to load quickly, because if they don't load quickly, the dye molecules are so small that they will start to spread and spread and spread and spread. Okay, so it'll be time for questions and answers. So let's go over a couple of questions that I've gotten already. I'll come back to what is the minimal equipment to teach this in high school science, because I've got a demo of that. And I can show you, you can do a much, much cheaper version of it than using all of this equipment, because micropipettes, for example, right here, run, depending on where you get them from and whether you get student version or professional version, $100 a piece to $200 a piece. The power supply is quite expensive. The gel boxes are quite expensive. So great if you have access to them through a lending group in your county, or through a university that does lending to local schools, because the actual consumables that we use are quite cheap. Dye, 1x TAE, you can buy a bottle of it for $70, but it will last you for a decade if you're careful, and it doesn't go bad. And the agarose is expensive, but there is a cheap replacement for the agarose. So we'll come back to all those additional things when I show you the other equipment. What are the signs that a student has not loaded the well correctly? Some signs are that has literally floated up and out. That's not very likely in here unless they completely load completely above the gel. But it will happen if you're doing certain DNA type of gels where you actually have proper DNA that might be mixed with an ethanol solution. And then that will float away if they haven't done the protocol correctly. With the dye electrophoresis, you're more worried about them poking through the bottom of the gel. So you want to make sure that you show the video that shows how to properly load a gel, and emphasize you want to have the tip right above the well, submerged through the buffer solution, but just barely hovering over the well, not into the well, because then you can poke through the bottom of it, and then when you load it, it just diffuses everywhere and is gone, and then the students cry. Now that's one of the benefits of only having 3 suspects, is you have plenty of extra wells if you need it. And then what is the maximum and voltage and minimum voltage for running a successful gel? With this, if you're using 0.25x, you can go up to 200 volts, which allows you to do a faster run without melting your gel. And then if you are doing a 1x buffer solution in your chamber, then you really only want to go no more than 120 volts, but usually 100 volts. Okay. Let's see, are there any other questions? Doesn't look like it. So I will get to the final question as I show some results. So let me just hit stop so I can move this out of the way. So if we just look, let's see if we can just reveal here. I just hit stop. You can see just the beginnings of separation here. You can see just barely. The beginnings of separation, they've moved out of the well. and they were starting to move from the black towards the red, away from the negative, because all these dyes happen to be negatively charged. You do have to be careful. There are certain dyes you can get, industrial dyes you can get, that are positively charged, so you want to verify that you have negatively charged dyes if you're going to use it in this type of setup. And it's moving towards the positive. And that's quick little physical science / chemistry review, depending on what level of science background your students have. So we can just begin to see separation. So let's look at a gel that has completed its run. So here we go. So a lot of times it's just easier if you get a white background or some sort of background. So I'm going to actually pull the tray out. Ooh, that background does not work so well. Okay. Where's that background? Let's see. So I need something with a plastic white background. Oh. As you can see, it's easy to break a gel. That one just slid right out. I'm not going to freak out too much about it. Just move it to the edge. There we go. Oh, there we go. So as you can see here, in the first lane, we have blue, red, and yellow. Oh, this is interesting. And in the second lane, we just have blue. In the third lane, we have blue, red, and yellow. And in the fourth lane, we have blue and yellow. And so these are our mock DNA bands that were created through PCR. And so we could say the crime scene, lane 1, and suspect 2, which was the maintenance guy, had matching DNA bands. Now, if you have higher math, you could talk about probability if you're only looking at a 3-band match versus real forensics where they have many, many more bands to work with, so that they can get to the chances of 1 in millions, 1 in billions of getting a random match. 3-band match, not so good. But with dye electrophoresis, it's a quick little fun exercise. So you can see that it was the maintenance guy who saved the science building from the 6-foot cockroach. And now that book is soaking wet. So let's look at some of the cheaper versions you can use. Now, Bio-Rad, I know this sounds like an advertisement for Bio-Rad. I just happen to have a lot of access to Bio-Rad equipment, so it's what I'm most familiar with. There are a lot of other supply companies out there. Has made up where you can kind of get an all-in-one kind of selection, or you can cobble it together, but you can look on their website to see kind of how they put it together. The equivalent of pretty much like a little camp soap dish, and then you have to make some sort of comb, because combs, if you order them, are about $50 a piece. So, I mean, they're reusable, but they're not cheap. But as long as you have something that won't have a problem getting wet, and then you could probably make it with some sort of plastic and razor blades. And, I would suggest you do it, not your students. This was done on a laser cutter at our county office of ed. So, soap dish, you pour the agarose in here, and then all you're going to do is you grab your buffer. Just going to pour just a splash in to help you get the comb out. Okay, and then you again pull the comb straight up. So the last thing you want to do is break the spaces between the wells. Okay, and then the soap dish becomes its own electrophoresis chamber. You use it's a fancy, just reused. When you don't turn in your cards when you go to stay in the hotel. So just cut that. You cut your little bit of extra. And then you pry it up. So until I get the other side. Out. If you're really cheap, you can actually recycle that, because the beauty of gels, as long as they don't have any dyes or any other contaminating agents, you can throw that in a bottle and remelt it. And so now you have your little tiny gel, your wells that you can load in. Okay, you need to pour more running buffer in. And then you use very, very fancy electrodes, otherwise known as undone paper clips. Now I'm just doing this quickly. Get up there. So far, I mean, yeah, you've got to go source out some soap boxes, but, you know, the travel bins at your local drugstore type place work pretty well. One thing that's not impossible to come by, if you have a good relationship with a pharmacist or someone who has like insulin dependency, is if you get the equivalent of an insulin syringe, obviously take the needle out carefully and dispose of it appropriately. And they fit nicely with the same size tips that we use on the 20 microliter micropipettes. And so then you can use those, and I'll just do one of these to load. And so you just put it in here. It's just like a syringe, which I'm not used to using, so there we go. That's way too much dye. I will just load a portion of it. That's closer to 100 microliters, not 15 microliters. But then, carefully stabilizing yourself, just load it in there. Yeah, as you can see, I'm not very used to using this style. Okay, and then just, it's not a nice, neat little ejector, so you have to snap it off and drop it. Obviously, don't throw these away. They're precious because most places you need a prescription to get them. So, obviously, don't get them used. Okay, and so you load it, and then you once you've loaded it, something you can probably snag from your physics teacher are some alligator clips. And you want the black near where you loaded the dye, the thing on, and the red on the other side. And then you get an assembly of 9-volt batteries. This is the major expense with this. So if you had some way to have a cheaper source of voltage and energy to run your gel, that would be your #1 thing. But the rest of this is really cheap stuff to just cobble together. And then so you just make sure you connect the black to the negative side. And my fingers are slippery. Come on. Why will they not? There's there. And then the red, the positive side. And if you look very carefully, you get very tiny bubbles, so this runs much slower. And so, yeah, let's go ahead. Let me just got another magic kitchen moment. Here we can see, though there's a bunch of dye diffused across it. If you leave it long enough, it will run. I'm just gonna go to the sink and flip it so I can just pull the gel out. There we go. Now you got a better view. Okay, so there you can see that you can, well, do this in a much cheaper fashion, where your only major expense is battery replacement. Let's see. Any other questions? Well, I think that's it.